guys, welcome to another video. Today it is another in the Can I Sew a Dress in a Day series, and today we are going to be doing the by hand London Anna bodice with a 5-panel circle skirt, and I'm going to be showing you my tips and tricks for working with large and directional prints. So the print in question is the Foxy Woodland cotton lawn from Lady McElroy. I put up a vote on the community tab and I didn't give you any kind of indication what it was or anything, so before the waffle came out explaining the vote, the question was foxes or leaves, and the overwhelming majority of you have voted for foxes. Now don't worry, I will be doing the leafy one as well, working with that panel print, because it's going to be interesting for me to try and work out how I want to get that done. I will at some point do the panel print as well, but foxes won the day. So I had always planned to do the by hand London Anna bodice with this print because I really like that bodice. There is a big expanse of fabric at the top of the bodice where there are no darts or tucks or anything interrupting it, so you can put something like this very cute little fox front and center and it won't get interrupted. I use the by hand London bodice a lot for large prints for that reason, and that is something to consider when you have a print like this. You want something that's not going to have too many seams in it, too many darts, too many things that are going to interrupt the print, especially if it's something as recognizable as an animal. You don't want to be, as we learnt when I did my Dolce & Gabbana cockatoo dress, you don't want too many tucks and things going into the animal to kind of distort the overall appearance of it. The other thing that I'm going to be doing is smooshing on the 5-panel circle skirt, and there is a tutorial on how to draft that. That is something that is really good for directional prints, because circle skirts, if you just cut them out normally, you end up with the print going the right way down the center front, but then it can be very skew if off to the sides, and if it's a very obviously directional print it can look a little bit odd. Not always, I mean very full circle skirts fall in such a way that you won't necessarily notice that, hey, that fox is on its side, but you can get around that by drafting panels. I like a 5-panel circle skirt because you end up with a center front panel with no seam in it, and then you have panels that go for side panels and the back panels. You could obviously draft a 4-panel circle skirt, but then you end up with a center front seam, which is not my favorite, unless you are specifically trying to chevron stripes or something like that. Although the last time I did that I ended up with a 16-panel circle skirt, so that was fun. Again, there's a tutorial for that one as well, I'll link it in the description down below. Panelled circle skirts are also really good if you want a certain length of skirt but your fabric isn't wide enough to accommodate that in a traditional sense. So if you were doing like a full circle skirt and your fabric is not wide enough for the circumference of the hem to go onto the width of your fabric, if you put panels into it, that means you can make your skirt longer. You obviously sew the panels together to get the length you want from the width of fabric that you've got as well, so that's also another reason for doing a panelled circle skirt. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually get my lining prepped, which I've got back here. I'm going to get that cut out because I'm going to use that as my pattern piece to make sure that I am properly placing my fox so that it's front and center. I like to cut these kinds of prints on a single layer because I find it much easier to get the print exactly where I want it when it's on a single layer, rather than trying to get the fold in the right place on the fox so that the fox ends up on the center front, the proper center front of the bodice. So I'm going to get my lining cut out so I can then get the outer fabric cut out. Let's get started. Now, because I'm going to be using my lining as my pattern pieces, I want to make sure that I transfer all the markings over for the darts and tucks before I remove them from the paper pattern pieces. Okay, so I have got my lining cut out and all of my tucks and darts marked on, and I will have just shown you how I was doing that. The nice thing about this lining fabric is that it is fairly sheer and see-through, so what I like to do is put my lining over the print that I'm going to be using and work out where I want the print to feature. So I've decided I want this fox in the center front of the bodice because it's quite small. The other fox, which I don't know if you can see, here we go, yes, you can just about see there, that's quite a tall one, so I'm a bit worried that that would kind of maybe encroach on the darts and things. like a little bit of the bottom here kind of gets in the way of the darts or the tucks. This little dude, he's small, so I think he's going to be great front and center. So I'm going to, we want to make sure that you're keeping this on grain. You want to make sure that your center front, I can see I've got like a crease mark down here. The center front is going through the center of the motif. You could have it centered on the face of the fox, but then the motif is going to be further over to one side, which is not something I personally like. You need to bear in mind also your seam allowance at the top, which is 5/8 of an inch on this pattern, and you want to make sure that it is, as I say, on grain as well. So once you're happy with the placement of your pattern piece like this, you then want to pin it all into place and cut it out. One of the things to bear in mind when you're working with a print like this is that you are going to need slightly extra fabric to accommodate for fussy cutting, which is basically what we're doing, because as you can see, you know, I'm wasting this much fabric at the top. I mean, to be fair, I probably will be able to get a hair scrunchie piece up here so it won't go to waste, but you do want to bear in mind when you order your fabric for a print like this that you might want to consider ordering a little bit extra so that you can fussy cut out the motifs as you want them, where you want them. You don't want to be restricted by having slightly too little fabric to get the perfect placement. The other thing to bear in mind as well is the placement of the motifs when you're wearing the dress. Like, I am considering the center front of the dress because that's the most obvious part of the dress when it's being worn. I am not going to worry too much about the back of the dress. I could try and pattern match, but probably again that would end up taking up quite a lot of fabric. So the thing that I'm going to do with the center back is I'm going to make sure that the center back portion here is not going through a fox's face, so that I don't have to worry about pattern matching. And the same over here. Again, I don't want to worry about having half a fox in the center back portion of the dress, so I'm going to just make sure that where the zip goes in, the center back seam is not intersecting with any foxes at all, so that I don't end up with any deformed or half cut out foxes on the back. Now that I'm happy with the placement of this, oh, the other thing to bear in mind as well is if you're using two pattern pieces like this, make sure that you mirror them. Don't cut out two the same. Ask me how I know. So once you're happy with the placement and everything, pin it into place, cut it out, and then we can start working on the skirt.
Okay, so I did end up cutting my circle skirt centre front on the fold, but that was because the width of the fabric meant that I had to be completely folded perfectly in half so that I could fit it on, and as you guys know, I've run out of tracing paper, so I couldn't retrace the skirt. That was the point of this dress. So once I have my circle skirt front cut out, and I was careful about where the centre front fox went to make sure that the fox was a full fox without, you know, cutting through its head or anything. I then pasted on the side panels. Now the grain line for the side panels runs down the center. I think you can just about see the grain line marked on the pattern piece there, and I was trying to make sure that I had a full fox the right way up in the center of the panel as much as I could without wasting too much fabric. Once that one's been cut out, I take the pattern piece off of the fabric and then turn the pattern piece over. Now technically this is a symmetrical pattern piece, so technically I don't need to do that, but it's just a really good habit to get into if you're cutting out things out on a single layer like this, is to flip the pattern pieces over so that you get mirrored pieces, not identical pieces. So once the side panel pieces had been cut out, I could then cut out the back panel pieces. For the back skirt pieces, I wanted the grain to be on the center back seam, which is why I am placing the pattern piece on the fabric in this manner. So you can see that the straight edge, which is the center back, is on grain along the edge of the fabric. And again, I'm doing the same thing, cutting one out at a time, trying to make sure that I have a relatively decent placement for the foxes, that I'm not cutting any foxes in half around the waistline where it's going to be most noticeable, or on the hemline. So once that one's cut out, I can then flip the fabric over this time. I think that's what I do. Yes, flip the fabric over and cut out the second back panel piece with, again, the centre back seam being on the straighter grain.
So when I was cutting out my pattern pieces, obviously my lining was an ivory colour, which meant that I could see through it and see the motif underneath. If you're using a darker lining or something that is completely opaque and that you can't see through, you might want to think about getting some Swedish tracing paper and tracing out the full front bodice, and so not one that you cut on the fold like a usual pattern piece, but tracing out the full flat piece that could then be cut on one single layer. When I'm tracing patterns, I tend to use Moorplan's tracing paper, which is very paper-like, but it's not quite see-through enough. But for things like that, where I want to be able to position a motif really accurately, that's when I will use Swedish tracing paper. So that is just something to bear in mind, that if your lining is opaque or your lining is dark and you can't see your motif through it, do think about tracing out the full front bodice on the flat so you can cut it out as a single layer with Swedish tracing paper, which is see-through. Everything is cut out, and I had some odd shaped pieces, so I have managed to cut out a fairly decent chunk of bias binding, and that's going to be the first thing that I get done, because I'm then going to work on the skirt, which will need bias binding down the centre back seam, and I'll French seam everything else. Right, so yes, bias binding, that's going to be my first task. Get this all sewn together, trimmed, pressed and wrapped onto a card. See how much I've got. Fingers crossed it'll be enough to, well, it's definitely going to be enough to do the skirt. I think the circumference of this hem is about 6 meters, so there's definitely going to be enough to do that. So yeah, get this sewn and then we can move on to the skirt. Bias binding is complete. I have 11 meters, which should be more than enough for the back seams and the hem of this dress. So now that that's done, I'm going to start putting the skirt together, and I'm going to French seam the panels together and then use this for the centre back seam as mentioned. Okay, skirt is done, and now it's time to work on the bodice. So as you will have seen in the previous footage, I've already marked on all of the darts and tucks, so I just need to get them pinched together, pinned and sewn. Then I can start the construction. It'll definitely get done today, including making the bias binding and cutting it out, because it is a very quick dress to do. I'm really looking forward to seeing how it comes out as well. I love the skirt, and I ended up with about just under 1.5 meters of fabric left over. I had 5 to start with, so I think I'll be able to do some kind of shirt with what I've got left. But again, because of the print, I'm gonna have to be careful about how it gets, so maybe not a shirt, maybe a top, or we shall see. But there's fabric left over to do something else with, which is awesome. Anyway, bodice time, let's get that done. I think this is always going to be my favourite part of sewing, bagging something out. It's just like magic. Once I'd attached the bodice to the skirt, I could add in the zip, sew up the centre back seam, attach the lining and put the bias binding onto the hem. I did indeed have enough, the 11 meters more than covered it. Once the binding had been machine sewed down, I pressed it to the inside and hand stitched it into place, and the dress was finished. It's going to come as a surprise to none of you that I love this dress. You guys have seen me make this bodice with different skirt combinations many times over the years, and I gravitate back towards it because I wear it so often. I feel comfortable in it. It's a fun make, and it's also, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, a really good canvas for a large print like this. I love how the circle skirt has turned out, and paneling the circle skirt has meant that the foxes for the most part are the right way up. I'm very pleased that I didn't try and pattern match the centre back seam. I think the approach that I used, making sure that there wasn't a fox's face in the centre back seam, has worked really well. I have ended up with like a little fox on either side, but again, that's not really the focus of attention. Obviously as well, I can't see the back, so the back doesn't, you know, really matter that much to me. It's other people that can see it. Technically I did have enough fabric to pattern match the back properly, but I don't think that it would have been worth it at the end to have used that much fabric, if that makes sense. It was totally doable, but because the print is so large, it would have meant more fussy cutting, which would have meant more random placement of bodice pieces which might not have necessarily ended up giving me the amount of fabric that I've got left, because I do have about 1.3, 1.4 meters of this fabric left, which I'm not sure what I want to do with. It would be very easy to make a top, a by hand London Anna top, because we know how well this has turned out, but I would like to try and do something different. So I'm going to have a look through my patterns and have a think about what I could do with a cotton lawn that has a giant print on it that I have a limited amount of fabric of. If you have any suggestions, let me know in the comments section down below. So hopefully you found my tips and tricks for working with large prints helpful. Do you have any tips and tricks yourself that you have come up with over the years for working with large prints? Let me know in the comment section down below. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't yet, please subscribe, and I'll see you again very soon. Bye!